Mum.
She'll be fine with it.
But what if she's not? What about Will? What about my dad?
Text Will so he knows you're safe and where you are. Then turn your phone off. We'll deal with everyone in the morning.
Wow.
What do you think?
I think it's a really excellent plan.
The Archers was written by Katie Hims and the farming and countryside advisor is Fiona Mountain. It was directed in our Birmingham studio by Pip Swallow and the editor is Jeremy Howe.
Hello, I'm David Yelland, former editor of The Sun.
Hi, and I'm Simon Lewis. I was Communications Secretary to the late Queen and Director of Communications for Gordon Brown when he was Prime Minister.
You're basically spin doctor extraordinaire.
And you were from time to time, David, my tabloid nemesis, I guess.
This is When It Hits the Fan.
Every week we're going to look behind the scenes and try and work out what's really going on when things hit the fan in a crisis.
The difference between what I read in the media about these things and what actually happens and what they care about is huge.
When It Hits the Fan, new for Wednesday evenings at 9 on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
Comics, Kapow Comics! It's the place for comic books, retro games, classic memorabilia, and more. Kapow Comics, 501-834-5769.
Any Questions is coming up in 3/4 of an hour, but now here on BBC Radio 4, Ellen E. Jones and Mark Kermode escape their dead-end town and hit the road. It's time for the Lovers on the Run films in this week's edition of Screenshot.
Hello and welcome to Screenshot, Radio 4's weekly guide through the ever-expanding universe of the moving image. I'm Ellen E. Jones.
And I'm Mark Kermode. Last week on Screenshot, we were stuck in our office cubicles dreaming about escaping the 9-to-5 grind in movies like Brazil and TV shows like Severance. This week, we're breaking free, ditching this dead-end town and hitting the road.
That's because, to mark the 50th anniversary of Terrence Malick's debut feature, the legendary and iconic Badlands, starring Martin Sheen and Sissy Spacek, we're turning our attention to Lovers on the Run. It's a movie genre that cuts through the heart of America like Route 66.
Little did I realize that what began in the alleys and backways of this quiet town would end in the Badlands of Montana.
That's Sissy Spacek there from Badlands with her wonderful voiceover. What's your take on Badlands, Mark?
Well, when it came out 50 years ago, I was 10 years old, so I didn't see the movie, but I saw the poster on all the train stations. I used to get the train to school, and the poster, which is very, very memorable, has got the silhouette of Sissy Spacek and Martin Sheen with a rifle over his shoulder, very much in the manner of James Dean on the poster for Giant. The very lengthy tagline said, "He was 25 years old, combed his hair like James Dean," so I got it already. She was 15, she wasn't very popular. For a while they lived together in a treehouse. In 1959, she watched while he killed a lot of people. And as a kid, I thought, that's the kind of movie I would love to see if only I was old enough.
Someone's misunderstood what a tagline's supposed to be.
Yeah, short and pithy.
It's not a novel.
It's not Meg 2, same old chum, is it? Years later, I saw it, I think, on a double bill. And what surprised me is it wasn't the film I had expected. So even the title Badlands makes it sound like a kind of gritty and aggressive kind of movie. And of course, it's got a very fairy tale, ethereal, dreamy feel to it, which is what Terrence Malick was aiming for. So I just remember it as being the contradiction between what I thought it was going to be and what it actually was. What about you?
I love Badlands. I love Terrence Malick's films, those early ones. Exactly that dreamy quality, that transcendental thing that you're talking about, all that golden hour light. Has there ever been a filmmaker make better use of golden hour light than good old Terry Malick?
Yeah, until after Tree of Life, and then it all went a bit pear-shaped.
We don't talk about that.
We don't talk about those, yeah.
I also love Lovers on the Run movies as a genre, but I'm quite particular. I do think that they have to involve actual lovers.
Right, and
they
have to be
on the run. Yeah, I'm a stickler
You are
for
so fastidious when it
accurate
comes to
genre
that
descriptions.
stuff.
I don't think that's too much to ask. Anyway, later in the programme, I'll be talking to two filmmakers who've taken this American classic genre out for a spin themselves, probably without a licence and definitely without their parents' permission. Greg Araki, the writer-director of The Living End and The Doom Generation, and Jonathan Entwistle, the director and co-creator of the recent Channel 4 TV series End of the Effing World.
First, though, if we're going on a road trip, we're going to need a map. Badlands might be one of the most celebrated Lovers on the Run movies, but it wasn't the first. For one thing, it owes a clear debt to Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde from 1967, and indeed Malick was one of Penn's protégés and gives him a credit at the end of Badlands. And of course, Bonnie and Clyde itself harked back to the American crime movies of the 30s and was influenced by the French New Wave. So to find out the lay of the land, I spoke to Christina Newland, chief film critic for the I newspaper, who a few years back compiled a terrific top 10 Lovers on the Run list for the British Film Institute, from Fritz Lang's You Only Live Once in 1937 to Greg Araki's The Doom Generation in 95. More of that later on. I started by asking Christina about the early days of the genre and where our cinematic obsession with lawless lovers on the run began.
I think to begin with, it is a very American thing because you have the birth of, in a big way, automobile culture in America in the early 20th century. And especially around the time of the Great Depression in the 1930s, you have the WPA, the government program, which set to building roads and highways and interstates to connect the more rural parts of America. As a result of that, by the 40s and 50s, you have a really dominant car culture in the States. And of course, it's a huge country. That then sets the stage for storytellers and filmmakers to use the automobile as this kind of vessel for two people to hop in. They don't have to have a lot of money. They don't have to have a lot of prospects, and to go on these adventures. The world was not like it is now. You could really get lost. Crossing state lines and moving in very rural places in America, you could become very hard to find. And so there's a sort of a romantic nature to that.
I gotta make a run for it. Give me the keys to your car.
But you didn't do it.
Give me the keys to your car. I gotta get going.
You can't run. There must be some other way.
The only way out's to lamb. You want me to burn for a job I didn't do?
Early filmmakers seized on that. One of my favorite early films in that period is from 1937 by Fritz Lang. It's called You Only Live Once, with Henry Fonda as an ex-con, trying to go on the straight and narrow, and then is falsely accused of a crime. Rather than end up getting the chair, he takes his wife and they hit the road. And that's a very romantic story of two people who've been cast out of society and are given no choice but to hit the road and find the wilds of America.
That idea that it's kind of precipitated by the birth of automobile culture, by the fact that you could travel long distances, apparently anonymously. You're not on a train, other people aren't going to see you, you're in a sort of buggy of your own. Does that create a new lover's environment? The car is your space and it can move, as opposed to a train in which it's everyone's space and they're all moving together.
When you get the apex of car culture, which is the 1950s car culture that we think of, lovers' lanes, couples making out at drive-in movies. It's their own little safe place that they're hidden away from the adult world if they're teenagers. Similarly, if you're up to no good, whether that's you're delinquent sexually, as the dominant culture of the time would have saw if you were a teenager and you're having sex, or you've actually done something bad, you've robbed a bank, you've killed someone, you've hurt someone, whatever you've done, the car kind of provides its own little safe place for you to escape.
Tell me where Gone Crazy fits into this, because I remember seeing Gone Crazy when I was at university, loving it, and then watching the Richard Gere Breathless, and of course they go to the movie theatre and it's Gone Crazy that's playing, and thinking, okay, so this is significant in this history. Why is it significant?
Gone Crazy is remarkable for a lot of reasons, one of which being that it was made in 1950, and it's really frenzied. It's telling the story of this professional sharpshooter who's very obsessed with guns, who goes on the run with a woman, Laurie Starr, who's played by Peggy Cummins. There is like a real voracious sexual energy between them, which is really focused on crime and specifically on gunplay.
We go together, Laurie. I don't know why. Maybe like guns and ammunition go together.
It's about American culture's obsession with guns at a very early stage in the conversation about this.
Yeah.
A kind of predilection for violence in a really prurient way. But it's also just amazingly shot.
It'll be a minute longer than I have to. Here goes nothing.
Okay.
There's this incredible shot. The camera's like in the back seat of the car and remains sort of in the back of this getaway car as the two of them go and rob a bank and then get back in. And it's one shot that follows them as they complete the crime.
First shot.
You don't see the entirety of the crime. There's a shootout outside, and they hop back in the car and hit the road. And it's really like technically and visually incredible.
Next time, stay in the car.
You telling me?
Well, I'm Miss Bonnie Parker, and this here's Mr. Clyde Barrow. We rob banks.
You can't talk about this sort of movie and not talk about Bonnie and Clyde. The like catalyst for that particular genre, which had long existed, becoming a way for the counterculture to talk to American audiences. Traveling through America allowed in almost like a picaresque sort of way for the protagonist to meet various denizens of American life in various segments of society.
Used to be my place, but it's not anymore. The bank took it.
Whether that's a gas station attendant, you could kind of meet these weird characters as you go. It allowed, I think, American directors to make comment on various aspects of American life, the conformist domestic culture of the era.
Yes, sir, they moved us off. Now it belongs to them.
Bonnie and Clyde is sort of a key text there, and that's before you get to its depiction of sex and violence being considered pretty outrageous for 1967.
Well, that's a pitiful shame.
You're damn right, ma'am.
One of the key themes of the film is that their relationship is essentially unconsummated unless it's through violence and through gunplay. At the end of it is famously an orgasmic shootout. That idea, though, seems to be embedded in films like Gun Crazy before it. It's not coming out of nowhere again.
No, it seems like there's a pretty intrinsic link with sexuality when we talk about Lovers on the Run films, and maybe that's partly to do with its origins as being this place for delinquent culture to meet, that kind of 50s idea of like teenagers in their cars. But then when we come to Badlands...
Did it go the way it's supposed to?
When the Sissy Spacek character, she finally loses her virginity, and she's like, oh.
Is that all there is to it?
Yeah.
Gosh, what was everybody talking about?
Both of these films kind of play with the idea of sexuality being the great transgression, but also it not necessarily expressing itself in the most romantic ways.
Well, I'm glad it's over. For a while, I was afraid I might die before it happened.
These films become tools for subverting what our traditional ideas of sex, romance, love, law and order are.
The idea that a lot of these stories are ripped from the headlines, which was a very big kind of B-movie thing. What's the inspiration behind Badlands? Because again, Badlands does have one foot in real life.
Yeah, it was a very, very famous case in the late 1950s. It was a 19-year-old guy called Charles Starkweather, and he had a 13-year-old girlfriend. He killed her whole family. Sort of was a major issue in the trial later on, how much she was party to that or not.
Yeah.
But she ended up going on the run with him. They killed, or she was kind of accessory to the crimes, maybe 11 people, or a series of crimes that really shocked America because they were so young, because they didn't seem to have any rhyme or reason to them. And so it really captured imaginations at the time. Eventually, they were caught, she was imprisoned, and he was given the electric chair. And when they asked him why, he didn't really have any good answer. More or less paraphrased in the Bruce Springsteen song inspired by Badlands. The senselessness of the violence is something that captured the attention of Terrence Malick when he went to make Badlands. And he does pull back a little bit from the reality of the story. It would have been hard to get away with depicting it on screen, and any sympathy or feeling you do have for the characters would be completely gone if they showed the level of violence towards, say, children and animals that actually happened in real life.
How important is it that Martin Sheen wants to look like James Dean, and even at the end of the film, when he's in the cop car, the only thing they notice is...
I'll kiss your ass if you don't look like James Dean.
It's a nod towards this idea that we have a tendency of romanticizing these lone criminal figures, especially when they're young and decent looking. And I think that for Malick as well, he's very specifically drawing a line between society's idea of what a delinquent was, the fact that he was this young, attractive, white man, that everybody's willing to cut him some slack, even though his crimes are actually appalling. I think it's quite an interesting statement, and it's still quite a queasy one. It's still quite uncomfortable.
Yeah. Tonight, I'm standing on Highway 666, running through towns like Cortez, Shiprock, Sheep Springs, and ending in Gallup, New Mexico. To some, a beautiful stretch of the American landscape. But to Mickey and Mallory Knox, who are still at large, it is literally a candy lane of murder and mayhem.
How does that set the template for Natural Born Killers? It begins life as a Tarantino screenplay. Tarantino has written True Romance, so he's revisiting this story over and over again. How does that then lead into Natural Born Killers?
Natural Born Killers wouldn't exist without a film like Badlands, because Badlands hits on a particular kind of disaffection and emptiness. And it is very interested in the trappings of its era, which maybe to us now are harder to see as critique because they're kind of retro to us now. But the whole blue jeans, rock and roll, obsession with James Dean, all the contemporary juvenile stuff that Kit and Holly, the main characters of Badlands, are interested in. It's sort of seen as window dressing for a certain inner emptiness or lack of moral compass. Natural Born Killers is doing the same thing with modern times. Oliver Stone is looking at how media and music video culture and video games and all these various things have filtered into this postmodern muck that has cluttered the brains of its main characters. The film is very much styled to be this kind of hip, critical view of what contemporary culture, pop culture, has done to our moral compass.
And do you think that is what it does?
No, not really.
What do you think of Mickey and Mallory, huh?
They're hot. I really struggle with Natural Born Killers. Sometimes it's really good fun, and it has some really great shocking moments. It's one of those things that's having its cake and eating it a little bit. Sort of pure exploitation movie in some ways, though it doesn't ever want to admit that it is.
Check all the great figures from the state.
So it's telling you on one hand this is all very bad, and these people have been influenced, they're empty-brained, they're zombies, they're these incredibly violent, manic figures, but it's enjoying how cool and fun it all is.
Yeah, you know, we respect human life and all.
But if I was a mass murderer, I'd be Mickey and Mallory.
Is it important that many of these relationships are dysfunctional to the point that they wouldn't work if they were staying in the same place? Because a recurrent theme of all of them is, if we run, we'll be fine. This can only work as long as we're on the run. It cannot stop.
Very, very few Lovers on the Run films seem to end happily, as far as I can think of it. Maybe True Romance. And that's a film which has a lot of fun with all these tropes, too. The hooker with the heart of gold and the suitcase full of money. It's doing every cliche from these films, and it's doing it in a really big, fun, OTT sort of way.
You and me, we can jump on any one of those planes out there and go anywhere we want. It gives me a whole new outlook. Love airports now.
We got lots to start over. We should go somewhere where we can really start from scratch.
But it does understand that the romance that we feel towards many of these characters, we're yearning for a happy ending, but we know that the moment they stop, society will rush in, reality will rush in, frequently the cops will rush in, and this can only ever end badly, with one or both of them being captured or killed, or some other kind of really fatalistic ending. Maybe that's part of the joy, is this idea that for a little while, as viewers, we're getting to see people escape from the status quo and escape from normality. And we kind of know, as a part of that bargain, more often than not, it's not going to end well.
A nationwide manhunt is underway after a police officer was shot and killed during a routine traffic stop last night in Cleveland, Ohio. Investigators are looking for two suspects, one African-American male and one female, in connection.
And if you take that tradition that we've looked at and you look forward to something like Queen and Slim, which feels like a different movie to me, but it's using those tropes, how does it differ from, or how does it mirror the ideas that we've talked about so far?
I think it's really smart in that it's not completely going against your expectations of the tropes of what all these films are.
I think we should go to Cuba.
That's what I'm talking about. Isn't that where Assata Shakur went after she killed that state trooper?
Allegedly killed.
We just gotta keep driving.
But it's bringing in a contemporary politics, contemporary kind of social mores.
You're a black man that killed a cop and then took his gun.
I'm not a criminal.
You are now.
How lawlessness is viewed, and it brings in a racial element to that as well. So it's the best possible way to sort of update, I think, a genre which you could maybe argue is a little bit old hat. We kind of know where it's going and how it's going to get there.
All we can do is go forward. There is nothing back there for us. Please. Let's just keep going.
Christina Newland. Ellen, do you think that with films like Queen and Slim, the genre can just keep going?
Absolutely, and I love that it does that by making explicit actually something which has been present in these films from the very beginning, which is this kind of weird contradiction and hypocrisy at the heart of these movies and American society in general, I think, around how do you have a society and a nation which pedestals outlaws, right? The folk heroes in America are often these outlaw figures. And I think Lovers on the Run movies are often an expression of that, and Queen and Slim knows it. From the beginning, the US Constitution was written to enshrine the rights of the people at a time in history when indigenous people and enslaved people weren't considered in that category of the people. No matter how law-abiding their behaviour of people of colour, in the subsequent decades and centuries, they often find themselves outlaws in the sense of being outside the law's protection.
So accidentally outlawed just by the nature of who they are.
Exactly. And Queen and Slim shows that by having the initial scene in which they go on the run, their escape is instigated being not through them robbing a bank or getting into a shootout with their parents, just from them being pulled over by a police officer who is himself corrupt and racist and then shoots them. That's what starts it off.
I think there's a fascinating relationship between this and like the predecessors being Bonnie and Clyde and Abu Dussouf, the Jean-Luc Godard film. But this appears to be in conversation with those films. It's not just another instalment. It appears to be having a dialogue with them, almost a riposte to them. And I was reminded of the fact the critic Jay Cox said of Badlands that it is less a companion piece to Bonnie and Clyde, more an elaboration and reply. And I think that is true of Queen and Slim in the way that it lives in and refers to the Lovers on the Run genre.
For me, the most important consistency between all these films is the fact that the Lovers on the Run look incredible. They're very cool. They're aspirational. You can absolutely get swept up in the kind of romanticisation and their self-romanticisation of these characters.
And just how cool they look is put into stark relief by the 1970 film The Honeymoon Killers, which is kind of adjacent to this list. It's a black and white film, again, inspired by a true story, a very grim true story. And the two central characters, they are involved in murder and all manner of foul goings-on. And the film, it's got a kind of fetid documentary air. There is nothing romantic about it at all. Their company is really, really hard work, and it's a very, very alarming film. And it makes you realise how much all the other films in the Lovers on the Run genre are kind of, they are romantic and they look beautiful because they don't in The Honeymoon Killers.
Yeah, equally a ripped from the headlines true crime story as is Badlands, but couldn't be more tonally different.
Do you think it's interesting what Christina was saying, that these relationships always have to be doomed? Because she was saying that she couldn't think of many happy endings, with the possible exception of True Romance. Although, of course, in the original Tarantino script for True Romance, it is a doomed romance, but Tony Scott kind of fell in love with the character of Clarence and thought, I need to give him a more redemptive arc. But generally, they have to be doomed.
Well, they get away with it in Natural Born Killers, also a Tarantino script, of course.
Although that's different because that's Oliver Stone hitting you over the head with his media textbook about, look how bad the media is,
Hitting us on the head almost as violently as Mallory and when he do it in the film itself. I would agree with that. I do kind of have a lot of sympathy, actually, for Tony Scott's getting swept up in the fairy tale, because I think that's part of it, isn't it? Wanting to go along with it. And in fact, if there was one of these movies that I would have loved to have had a happy ending, for them to genuinely escape the people on their tail, it would have been Queen and Slim. Because I think if there's ever a moment when audiences could do with a little bit of escapism in that respect, it's in that movie. We all know that, characters like that would probably be shot within the first 10 minutes. But in this instance, it would have been nice if it had been otherwise.
You're listening to Screenshot on BBC Radio 4. Ellen, your turn to take the wheel. Where does the road lead you?
Well, I have two strong opinions about Lovers on the Run movies. One is that they're very, very American and all about America's sense of national identity, and like kind of latter-day Western. And the other is that, in part because America is changing, these movies are about to run out of road very soon if they don't also change direction. Right. So I wanted to speak to two people who would agree with me entirely and confirm all of my prejudices, the only kind of conversations I like to have days. In a minute, we're going to hear from Jonathan Entwistle, a brilliant Brit living in LA, who had the properly mad idea to tell a Lovers on the Run story against the backdrop of Britain's A roads and service stations. But first, I caught up with Gregg Araki, a name which still strikes fear into the heart of the staid, stale, critical establishment to this day. Gregg Araki is a key figure of the new queer cinema movement and the writer-director of absurdly cool 90s indie movies. I actually used to have a still from his movie Nowhere stuck on the cover of my homework folder when I was at school.
Why does that come as no surprise, Ellen?
I hadn't actually seen it, I should say. I was just being a bit of a poser.
Posy image.
Yeah. Two of Araki's movies are in the Lovers on the Run vein. The Living End from 1992, which has been described as the gay Thelma and Louise.
Although surely Thelma and Louise is the gay Thelma and Louise.
You might have a point there, yeah. And The Doom Generation from 1995, which stars Rose McGowan, Jonathan Schaech and Araki's frequent muse James Duval as a trio of lovers on the the Run. A new 4K restoration of The Doom Generation has recently been released. I've seen it in the cinema and it is gorgeous. A very good-looking film. I began by asking why this genre appealed to him.
I made these movies back in the early 90s. The Living In particular was sort of a response to kind of the AIDS crisis. You know, I used to write papers about these sort of outlaw couple on the run movies when I was in film school. My thesis was kind of that a lot of these movies sort of come out in times of social and cultural stress and upheaval. So there were a lot in the 30s during the Depression and a lot during the 60s during the sort of unrest in the United States. And so the 90s to me was kind of a time that was similar to that. I think there's a sense of like searching for answers or searching for some sort of utopia on the road. And that's kind of where both Living In and Doom Generation come from, that sense of yearning. Calling back to the whole genre of, you know, Bonnie and Clyde and They Live by Night and Gun Crazy and all of those films. I was just sort of using that genre to tell a certain story and to deal with topical themes of that time. Both Doom Generation and Living In are definitely aware of that kind of history.
It's not the 70s anymore when being married to a bisexual was fashionable. I just can't take this anymore, Ken. I can't take this anymore.
How do you think it changes the dynamic of these movies when there's 3 people in the car instead of 2?
It definitely changes the dynamic and makes it, to me, more interesting. From the beginning of time, there's always just been boy meets girl, and having a third person, queerness or bisexuality or all these other elements keeps it fresh or keeps it interesting and unique, as opposed to just, boy meets girl and whatever. That story is so dead and so stale, it kind of has nowhere to go at all.
Your films seem to reveal to audiences that there's something intrinsically queer about this idea of outlaw lovers on the run as well. Would you agree with that?
Well, definitely in heterosexual outlaw couple movies, there's a sense of them being outside of society. That's one of the things I think that really appeals to me about that genre. My movies are always about outsiders, and that's something that is built into Couple on the Run movies. They're trying to build a new life outside of mainstream society. I grew up with like punk rock music, and so I've always viewed myself as being on the outside. And I do think that Living In and Doom Generation both definitely come from the outside.
Is this Night of the Living brain dead? Wake up and smell the cappuccino, geek.
A lot of your movies have these cheeky introductory titles like An Irresponsible Movie by Greg Araki or something.
And a heterosexual movie by Greg Araki.
Do you ever worry that, you know, good-looking young criminals are being unduly romanticized by our culture? Do you ever have that concern for real?
Honestly, there are so many other things to worry about in contemporary society, particularly in the post-Trump world that we live in. Doom Generation and Living In both, they're not nihilistic in the sense that they're true criminals. They're really kind of innocent, caught up in the circumstances that lead them to have to go on the run. So I don't think that either of those movies really romanticize crime in any way. I think my audience is very smart and very sophisticated and not real lowbrow, that they take things at face value.
I think sometimes the city is sucking away at my soul. Like yesterday, I was stuck in this humongous traffic jam on the 405 freeway. And I just couldn't wait to get to the dead bodies lying there on the bloody asphalt. Like all I cared about was getting out and moving again.
It's crazy how these films continue to feel youthful and exciting and transgressive and are being embraced by, you know, another generation of druggy young people with excellent haircuts and loose morals.
Every screening I would ask, like, how many people have never seen the Doom Generation before? Because I just thought it would be kind of old-timers coming out for a trip down nostalgia lane. But it was almost always, like, at least half the audience or more were just new people. And a lot of the audience is so young. They weren't even born when this movie came out. It's always amazing to me, 28 years later, it still has it and people are still excited about it. It's really so humbling and so incredible to me.
What are your theories on how it continues to feel so fresh and relevant?
There was nothing like it then, and there's nothing like it today. It's still so unique and so fresh. Like, movies have gotten more mainstream, more predictable. And this movie was always intended to be like unsafe. I remember when I was trying to get it made, I was telling people I wanted it to be like Last Tango in Paris for teenagers. It was always the intention of the movie to not be like, oh yeah, this is the watered down version for, everybody. It's extremely personal, and its intention is purely expressive of just whatever was in my head when I was 31.
The test only verifies that you have the antibodies to the virus. And as you're probably aware, many people live perfectly healthy, normal lives for years and years. So by no means should you consider this a death sentence.
People talk a lot about, the vivid colours of your movies. But there's a lot of what I would call visual satire of Americana as well, like the Quickie Mart, garish fast food, a lot of like flag trashing. So I have to ask, why do you hate America?
I hate bigots and homophobes, but I love America in the sense of it being this big, vast, melting pot place and the possibilities of it. I think only in America could this sort of punk rock artsy kid from Santa Barbara have made these movies and lived the life that I live. So I feel like that aspect of it is very much a part of my identity and my sensibility.
Do you think there's something intrinsically American about these films?
Yeah, I think so, in the sense that America is so big and it's such a kind of vast wasteland that it is kind of a little bit of an American genre, I think.
Gregg Araki. A more recent update of the Lovers on the Run genre is the Channel 4 comedy drama TV series The End of the Effing World. Based on a comic book by Charles Forsman and adapted for the screen by Charlie Cavell, the programme follows an unlikely pair, James, a self-proclaimed psychopath, played by Alex Lawther, and Alyssa, a troubled teenager longing to escape home. She's played by Jessica Barden. In the comic book original, it's all American, but Jonathan Entwistle, director and co-creator of the TV series, decided to move the action to the UK.
We found the kids' most recent location. They robbed a petrol station 100 miles southeast of here this morning. Held it up at gunpoint, locked the manager in a toilet, got the CCTV.
I asked him to explain what inspired him about this story.
The first time I ever saw the comic books, I was struck by how cinematic they were. Often the shape of the frame was 2:3:5. It had the aspect ratio of a movie, and you would be two people in a landscape. And I was like, wow, that's so cool. I want to go to America and make this movie. And that became very apparent early on that was going to be incredibly difficult. So within that challenge of how do we adapt this story, we came up with this idea of like, well, wait a minute, how can we translate this into the sort of English vernacular?
Within the tradition of American movies and within the tradition of road movies, there's an even more specific idea of the Lovers on the Run movie. Were any of those films in your head at any point during the creation of this?
Badlands absolutely was right at the forefront because we were playing with the idea of the road movie and also the Lovers on the Run. But I think the most important piece of where the show originally starts from is this idea of like, what happens to the boy who thinks he's a psychopath when he accidentally falls in love on the road? What changes his mind? Why does he decide not to kill her, mapping that trajectory of, I won't say romance, because I don't think that the show is particularly romantic in terms of their relationship, and I actually like that. I see that as a bit of an antidote to perpetuating this idea of like, oh, well, shucks, you're in a car together. That must mean on a road, so it must mean you're going to have to make out at some point. And we actively try to push against that and show a different type of love. When you're 16, you punch your dad in the face, you steal his car, you run away, and then it gets really dark. What happens? The only person that you've got is the person that you're traveling with on this journey. And I think that love in that show is about their companionship just as much as it is about romance.
We should lie low for a bit. Wait a couple of days before we start getting on any trains or anything.
Why?
Because we robbed the guy, James.
He assaulted me.
Doesn't matter. We should go off grid for a bit.
What do you think are the most significant ways in which this act of relocating to England changed the actual substance of the story that you were telling in the show itself?
In a strange way, it made the show smaller in a good way. I think it allowed us to show that version of England that isn't just the centre of London, the centre of Manchester, and there's Glasgow for good effect. A road movie in America can literally exist because it can take 1 week to cross the entire country. Well, aside from the traffic and the 55-mile-an-hour zones, it's going to take you a couple of hours to get across England. And so I feel that we started to weave in different worlds. What happens behind the little chef on the A5? What happens if you were to pull off one junction earlier than you expect to and find yourself in an estate that you didn't know existed that was built in the grounds of a stately home? There are so many interesting things in England that are just off the motorway. It's really testament to the power of the aesthetic of England because we shot the entire show within the space of about 4 square miles in Guildford. We approached it replacing those iconic American locations with their English equivalent. And I think you're so used to seeing in a road movie the shot of the 2 kids on the run facing each other across the diner table. That's very important for the audience to see that. Even if it's in a different landscape, you still need to play with the vernacular because I think there's some audience satisfaction in that. And people are like, oh, now I know what show I'm watching. This is very cool. It's these great actors in this great world. But wait a minute, we're in England. There's something quite aspirational about that.
One of the things I enjoy most about your show is it both proves and disproves simultaneously my theory that Lovers on the Run movies are intrinsically American. Which aspects of the genre were the easiest to translate and which were the hardest?
The first difficult adaptation of the Lovers on the Run story was to take out some of the earnestness and bring some British irony and British bite into the story. What is in the book and the American version of the story is a very earnest, we are out together on the run and we're living this and my dad's annoying and everything is awful and we're doing this together. The British sensibility is to be like, okay guys, relax, because we don't work in those same ways.
So what's the plan then? Sail across the channel, get jobs at Disneyland, Paris, change our names?
It was a great challenge to lace an earnest story with a sense of English irony. And I think that we did succeed.
You said that you wanted the show to feel like it could be set any time from 1988 to 2006. Is there something about the Lovers on the Run genre that you find nostalgic?
Yeah, I think these days I find movies nostalgic, if I'm honest. And I do believe that there is a timeless quality that stretches from, say, the 90s up to 2006, because it's post a previous technology boom. When you see a show from 1989 or a movie from 2002, very, very similar aesthetic across the board. And I do believe that that is quite powerful and also quite reminiscent of the final golden age of cinema. But it's also the aesthetic of my childhood, from the 90s up to the mid-2000s when I became cynical, packed into one story.
We did the world a favour. If I was the police, I'd give us medals or something. They probably will.
They didn't.
I do think there is a sense in the air today of a current doomed generation, and I wonder if that does turn into a next wave of lovers trying to be on the run, or lovers trying to function in a world which is entirely different from maybe even a decade ago.
Jonathan Entwistle. Both series of The End of the Effing World, and that's F*****ing world, just in case you were
Thanks
wondering.
for clarifying.
Yeah, are available to stream on Netflix. Greg Araki's The Doom Generation's 4K restoration will also be out on Blu-ray in the UK later this month, and he's currently working on a 4K restoration of his cult film Nowhere. So I'm finally going to get to see it a mere 20 years or so since I pretended I had already seen it to all my friends. Mark, do you think that The End of the Effing World successfully translates this American Lovers on the Run genre to Britain?
I think it does. I think we need to acknowledge a couple of precedents. There's a Chris Pettit movie from 1979, British road movie that goes from London to Bristol, which is
epic.
kind of, yeah, exactly. And then from 2012, Sightseers, the Ben Wheatley film starring Alice Lowe and Steve Oram, who actually originated the project as a stand-up comedy act about two lovers in a camper van who travel around the country, and you gradually start to realize that they are killing people en route. And the more people they kill, the more epic the landscape becomes. But there is something sort of fantastically grubby and unromantic about the very black comedy of Sightseers. It's been described as like being nuts in May with axes, and that is pretty much what it is.
I always remember about that film the crocheted underwear.
Yes, the crotchless crocheted underwear, which is an image that will live in all our minds forevermore.
I mean, that's something I like about the Gregg Araki movies as well, actually. They're extremely sexually explicit, and as they should be, because these are films about lovers on the run, whereas a lot of these canonical lovers on the run films are strangely sexless. You know, in Badlands, when she loses her virginity, she's like, well, what's the big deal? In Bonnie and Clyde, it's bullets instead of sex. And in fact, there was an original version, apparently, of the Bonnie and Clyde script in which Clyde was portrayed as a bisexual and was they were having like a three-way relationship with their getaway driver, but they decided that was a bit too much for the audiences of the time.
Didn't fit Warren Beatty's image.
No. To me, that kind of rebuts the idea of the film as this sort of countercultural beacon, because what kind of countercultural film can't even include bisexual three-way, which, incidentally, Bisexual Freeway is the title of my new Lovers on the Run movie, which I'm going to put into production now that Intimate Requirements is dead.
It's also worth saying that Jonathan Entwistle talks about adding a British irony to an American genre, but as you heard from the Gregg Araki interview, Gregg Araki's movies are dripping with irony. In fact, the idea that American movies do not have irony it's not correct.
Yeah, we need to retire that phrase, British irony, don't we really? I do think, though, the one thing that is slightly different about what the Gregg Araki movies are doing versus what End of the Effing World is that those films, Gregg Araki's films, still do look very cool. You know, he might be kind of slightly undermining his characters and taking the mick out of them for how much they romanticize themselves, but they do still look great. They still dress great. They're still driving a great car. Whereas just by nature of being in Britain, where everything is just, you know, a little bit smaller and a little bit rubbish, all of the End of the Effing World is constantly kind of satirizing the pretensions of its characters.
And just a final point, on the subject of whether or not the genre will stop as a result of social media. I mean, surely like in Queen and Slim, as they travel, their legend precedes them, and everywhere they arrive, they are more famous than the last place they were. And that's, social media age, but maybe that's the same as in Bonnie and Clyde with sending in the poem in the newspaper and him saying, that's it, you've immortalized us right there. All it's doing is allowing the legends to be printed, albeit virtually printed.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of got what Jonathan Entwistle was saying about 2006, 2007 being this kind of cut-off point, because that was when smartphones became much more prevalent. And it does change a lot of our behaviours. But then I read about this time in 1933 when the police were investigating Bonnie and Clyde, and they went to their hideout and found all these undeveloped films. And from those films came the iconic pictures of the real Bonnie and Clyde, which were then translated into the iconography of the Arthur Penn film. So we've got like Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty replicating the positions of holding a gun against his chest that we've seen from those films. So that's like selfies from 1933, basically.
Okay, so what I take away from that is that the past is in dialogue with the present and the future, and this side of the Atlantic is in dialogue with the other side of the Atlantic. So to bring us back to where we started, are you still of the opinion that this genre is fundamentally American and fundamentally dying?
Yes. I don't always have to go on a journey. Sometimes I'll just, stay right in the dead-end town where I was in the beginning.
So you went on a journey from nowhere and you came all the way back to nowhere.
Yes, Nowhere. Great film by Gregg Araki.
That's it for this episode of Screenshot.
But join us next week when we're powering up and levelling up.
We'll meet a final boss because we're looking at video games.
Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Shot was presented by Mark Kermode and Ellen E. Jones and produced by May Lee Evans. It was a Prospect Street production for BBC Radio 4. At this time tomorrow, a more relaxing pursuit as we meet one of the world's most acclaimed ceramicists whose work has been shown in museums and galleries around the world and whose 2010 memoir retraced the dramatic and tragic story of his Jewish family. We'll meet him on This Cultural Life tomorrow night at 7:15. But next year on Radio 4, it's Any Questions, which tonight comes from Lancashire. Before that, a word from Nikki Beatty.
On tomorrow morning, Saturday Live, John Kay and I will be talking to the sparkling South African strictly professional dancer and now memoirist, Johannes Radaba, model, author and Mama Still Got It influencer Louise Boyce, the multi-talented and multi-stented king of live comedy Jason Byrne, and we have the inheritance tracks of former Pointless Man and best-selling author Richard Osman. What we'd like from you for tomorrow are the stories behind your most memorable dance. Email those to saturdaylive@bbc.co.uk and we're on air tomorrow morning just after 9.
BBC News at 8 o'clock. Police searching for the escaped terror suspect Daniel Khalif say a reported sighting of him could be very significant. A member of the public saw him climbing from beneath a lorry around a mile from Wandsworth Prison from where he escaped on Wednesday. Police are offering £20,000 for information leading to his arrest, although detectives have said he doesn't pose a threat to the wider public. The former soldier is accused of trying to spy for Iran. Jonathan Hall, KC, the government's independent advisor on terrorism legislation, believes he should have been in a more secure prison.
When you have someone who